Hi, good evening, everybody. Welcome back to Photography Live and Uncut. I'm Paul Griffiths. I'm delighted this week to welcome my guest, a UK photographer, nature and wildlife photographer. His name is Chris Weston. Chris, welcome to Photography Live and Uncut.
Paul, hi. Thanks for having me on the show.
No problem at all. I've been a long fan of your work, to be honest with you. I used to go to the Nikon meetings, and obviously we'll talk about the Nikon camera systems that you use. But obviously, seeing your books and all your sort of work that they were showing, and fantastic work, which I think, in actual fact, nice little segue from my point. I think we'll go straight to, in actual fact, to have a look at your work and discuss basically. If you'd just like to talk us through some of the images here. We're going to go straight back to the page where you wanted to start, which was starting out, which, as you mentioned, really gives you sort of how your photography has developed through. This one, of course, is of the zebras. I hope you can see that on the screen.
Yeah, I can, and this is kind of the photograph in a way that is most relevant to how I started out in wildlife photography, because I've been interested in photography from a very young age, but the wildlife element started a little bit later on when I was kind of a teenager. And what basically happened was I grew a fascination with inane questions about nature and how it works, like, why are zebras black and white striped when they live in the yellow savannah? And my fascination grew into this point that rather than just ask the question, I liked what the answers were. So I started to study these things. And when I learned some of the stories that went behind some of the fascinating connections in nature, how it all works, how it fits together, I started to then want to tell these stories. I wanted to, having found the answer, I wanted to tell people about it because it fascinated me, and I figured it would fascinate others as well. So, and this is a prime example, because this image came about by asking that question, why are zebras black and white striped? And I spent a lot of time the answer, and eventually found out it was all to do with lion behavior. It's all to do with camouflage. And you kind of think, you look at a zebra standing on its own, and you think, well, how can black and white stripes be camouflage? And yet, what happens if you ever watch zebras in the wild, you'll notice that they're very rarely on their own. They all herd together, and they all mingle and intermingle, and they're constantly moving. And what happens is that as they're moving, those stripes kind of converge to a point where a lion cannot tell where one zebra ends and another one begins. Which basically means it can't find the attack. It doesn't know where to strike, and there's no lion in its right mind that's going to go charging into a herd of zebra unless it knows what it's aiming for. And this is how it works, and it turns out it's one of the most effective forms of camouflage in nature. And so I wanted to create an image that sort of told that story. And I often use this image in presentations that I give. If you look at that top left-hand corner, I asked the question, can anybody tell me what part of a zebra that is? And there's a little bit of umming and ahhing, and then I ask a more pertinent question, which is, would anybody bet their life, literally, on what part of a zebra that was? And the answer invariably is no. And that's how it works, because a lion won't bet its life on it either. So,
no, exactly, yeah. I did. Funny enough, I was aware of the fact that zebras have a tendency to sort of stick together as a group, but I didn't realize it because it makes them look so much bigger. So of course the lion is not going to attack them because of he can't distinguish one zebra from the other because of the stripes.
Yeah, that's it. And if you actually watch lions hunting, what they do is they separate and get it out on its own, and then black and white things.
Yeah, exactly.
At that point, the lion, they can see the rump, they can see the neck. They're the two attack points, and they know what they're aiming for, and so that's how it works. And so I use that image for me is one of the most pertinent ones for describing how I got involved in wildlife, and what one of the things I'm trying to do all the time with photographs, which is to tell a story.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Let's move on to the next one, because it probably, in actual fact, I just, it's so dynamic, this one, showing the movement of the wildebeest. Tell us about this one.
Yeah, well, this is, again, it's another one which is kind of very indicative of the progression of my career in wildlife, because I'd been doing, professionally, I've been working for about 9 months or so, and I was on an assignment in the Serengeti, photographing the wildebeest migration, and I was supposed to be there for 3 weeks. And I think I'd been out for 2 days, and in the course of those 2 days, I had photographed pretty much every single aspect of wildebeest behavior that you can possibly imagine. And I was beginning to wonder what I was going to do with the next 19 days. And I don't know if you've ever studied wildebeest much, but they're not God's most alluring creature. And
no,
Africans describe them as the animal that God created out of the spare parts of all other animals. So when you actually watch them, I mean, basically they're just a very big brown antelope wandering around in a very big brown field. So, say after a couple of days of photographing their behavior and getting a lot of what I would call it like record shots, I was a little bit stuck. And so on the next day, the third day I was there, I actually decided to go out without the camera and just to go out and observe what I was seeing, and just take a bit of time just to, rather than constantly take pictures, take some time just to kind of connect with what I was witnessing. And it was during that third day that I started to really understand what the job of a wildlife photographer is. And this picture very much displays that, in that as I was watching the wildebeest, I started asking myself the question, what is migration? I'm here photographing the Great Migration, but what is migration? And thinking about that, I started to think, well, migration is movement.
Yes.
It's the movement of animals from point A to point B, or people for that matter. But migration is movement. And it suddenly struck me that movement was the story that I should be photographing, not wildebeest.
Yeah.
And it was that point that I really understood that, when we go out to photograph wildlife, if all we ever do is photograph the surface, what is plain for people to see, then all we ever create are record shots or the duplicates of what anybody else has photographed. And in reality, as photographers, our aim should be to tell our story. And in this case, for me, it was movement. And then for the next 18 days while I was in Tanzania, I photographed a whole series of images that used wildebeest as the backdrop, but they were very much secondary to what was the key story to that assignment, which was movement. And so I photographed them in many, many different ways. This is one example. And I'm often, people who see this often say it reminds them of cave paintings.
Yes, exactly.
And for that, it's quite a powerful image. But I shot lots of images of using generally slow shutter speeds.
Yeah.
To dictate or to show movement in many, many different ways. With large herds will moving and in a single line like this one, or individuals and things like that. But it was, for me, it was that light bulb moment that really started to help me understand what it was I was trying to do as a photographer.
And I think another thing you mentioned there is very important, which not very many guys would sort of stop and think about. I've heard this from other photographers, is to go out without your camera and and look and feel and get an idea of potentially what you can achieve with your camera when you go out again. With the wildebeest there, that's really is a classic example. Let's moving on to another gallery here, Chris, where you seem, in these images, you seem to be so close, frighteningly close. Perhaps you could just give us an idea of what sort of equipment you're using for these images that we're showing here.
Yeah, and I think there are probably two important points behind that. And the first one is, because it's a question I get asked a lot. I mean, my favorite lens for wildlife photography is a 50mm standard lens. And a lot of people sound very surprised when they hear that.
Yeah, I can imagine.
That's my favorite lens. The lens I would say I use the most is the 70 to 200mm medium short medium to long medium telephoto zoom. But what it does mean is that I am often because I'm using such short focal length lenses, it does mean I need to be closer to the. And so one question I'm asked a lot is, how do you get close to wildlife? And the answer to that is I don't. I never get close to wildlife, but I do allow wildlife to come close to me. And it's a subtle difference, but it's a very important difference, because what I'm doing in that situation is that I'm allowing the animal to make the choice as to whether it comes close to me or whether it stays back. I never try and invade its own comfort zone, if you like, its own sort of circle of fear, which animals, including us, around them. So I think initially that's an important factor. The second thing with this particular image and the one that follows it, the elephant, both of these were shot on 50mm lenses. And there's a very, very significant reason for that, in that one of the things that I'm trying to do with the photograph is to involve you as the viewer in the moment. What I want to do is kind of put you put you where I am and say, no, this is what it feels like to be this close to these sorts of animals. It's about involvement, because there are two ways of looking at a photograph or taking a photograph. One is as what's happening, and one is being, as I say, being involved in it. And for me, really, it's about that involvement. And one of the reasons that I love using the 50mm lens is because, going back to the traditions of photography, of course, the 50mm is the standard lens, which we used to get with the cameras when we bought them. As most people know, is the lens that gives you pretty much what we see as humans through our own eyesight. And so what happens when you use a 50mm lens in a situation like this is it shows you exactly what you would see if you were standing there. It doesn't compress the space like a telephoto. It doesn't sort of distort it like a wide angle. It shows you what you would see. And that use of the lens, 50mm standard lens, helps then to create this impact of, wow, I'm there, because it looks like it would look if I was actually standing in that situation, or floating in the case of those two.
Or waist high in water, by the looks of things, in both cases.
It was.
Some of these images I'm seeing here, either you're laying down on the ground and this animal is jumping over you, or you've done some clever trickery work with remote control. Which one was it on this case?
Yeah, well, this is an interesting story, because it kind of follows on from the wildebeest picture earlier on, because I actually have a bit of a soft spot for photographing them. And a little bit later on, after the Tanzania assignment, I was doing some more photography, and I was again watching wildebeest charging in large herds, and again sort of connected to this idea of involving people in the moment rather than just being a voyeur. I was watching these wildebeest running sort of straight past me, and I suddenly thought to myself, I wonder what it would be like to stand in front of a herd of charging wildebeest. and so I had this idea for a picture, and I couldn't let it go. So I actually started off trying to do it with remote cameras, but the problem was that wherever I put the camera, the wildebeest would run in a different part of the savannah. And I put it over on the right, and they'd run on the left. I put it on the left, they ran on the right. If I put one on the right and the left, they ran down the middle. So so in the end, I kind of figured that in order to get the image, I would actually have to be there with the camera. But of course, I didn't really want to stand in front of a herd of charging wildebeest, because that would have been silly. So what I ended up doing was digging a pit in the ground. And so basically what's happened with this image in the following view is that we dug this pit. It's about 4 foot cubed, so it's about 4 foot deep and 4 foot wide. And we then we kind of built it with a lip, so it had this sort of L shape before it went into the dip. And then in the lip we put railway sleepers, and then over the top of the railway sleepers we laid a tarpaulin, and over the top of our tarpaulin we put earth. And so all that was basically left at the end was this tiny hole for me to poke the camera out of, and I was in the pit, and while the animals are running over. So they are in fact running literally right over the top of me, and but in entirely safe circumstances, because down underground protected by these railway sleepers. But it was a fascinating experience, and just hearing the sound of 100 Whos running over the top of you.
Yeah.
Every time they would come past, the dust that they kicked up would literally fill this small area, to the point I couldn't breathe for about a minute.
Yeah.
Because of all of the dust in the hole, and then I had to let the dust settle. So it was fascinating to get that experience of knowing what it's like to be in these situations. And of course, if you're a predator in those situations, then this is the sort of thing that you're contending with when the animals are running from you. So, it's all about making.
Sorry, carry on.
Yeah, and I say it's all about making a connection with the wildlife that I'm photographing, and this goes back to the point you were saying before about what photographers say about you have to take the time to make that connection, or the subject, whatever it is, you have to take the time to make a connection with it. For me, before you can actually start to photograph it, have that connection, it's very difficult to understand what it is that you are trying to communicate through your photographs.
Yeah, exactly right. Yeah. How did you? What have you done basically to your equipment to protect it against the dust and in these sort of areas? Have you used any form of protection on the cameras?
Nothing bespoke. I mean, with the wildebeest images in the pit, I just have the camera wrapped in plastic, and I did have a large number of UV filters. So that when the dust had settled, rather than having to clean the filter and start again, I could just unscrew it and put it on. And that kind of got through about a dozen of that particular shoot. But otherwise, no. I mean, I think one of the great things about modern cameras is that they are built substantially. And
yeah, very true.
Particularly the high end semi-pro and prosumer and top end pro stuff.
Yeah.
Whether it be the Nikons, whether it be the Fujis, their ability to work in these sorts of environments is really quite incredible.
Yeah.
So,
tell us about this charging line here, Chris. Don't tell me it was taken with a 50 mil lens again, was it?
It actually was. It wasn't. It was shot at 70 mil. It was on a 24 to 70 zoom lens. I think it was about 65 mil. I think it was set at the end.
Yeah.
But this is probably one of my most popular images, I have to say. And, the interesting thing that I learned in taking this image was that I was in the back of a Jeep, and what we'd done, it was a flatbed truck basically, and we'd put the end flap down so I could shoot straight out. So I'm lying on this flatbed truck, which is driving away as the lion's chasing after it. And this actually is a relatively, I mean, he's not an old male, but he's old enough. But he was alone. He was an individual, and he was quite hungry. So
yes,
what we'd basically done is we'd tied a piece of meat to the back of the truck and was dragging the meat, and that's what he's chasing.
Right. Okay. Seems as though we've been through the walls a bit. That you can just see on here where I'm showing with the cursor. There's a couple of. It looks like some teeth marks. He's been in a few fights by the looks of things.
He's certainly been around the block, and
fair enough.
The one thing that you don't get from the picture is that at one point, I mean, he was chasing us for probably about 100 yards in total, and at one point he roared. And there are two ways that lions roar. They either roar to communicate with each other, to say, "Look, I'm over here," or they roar in anger. And this was a roar in anger. And I remember distinctly when he did it that for the briefest of moments, it was less than a second, I just completely and utterly froze. It was almost like the roar had paralyzed me.
Yeah.
And then I just carried on taking pictures. And what was interesting was that about 6 months after I took the image, I was watching a documentary on the Nat Geo channel. And it was about predators, and it was saying on this documentary, it said that one of the tactics that predators use is to roar in such a way that it momentarily paralyzes the prey.
Yeah.
Because that split second of hesitation is enough.
Yes.
The edge in catching the animal. And I was watching this documentary thinking, yeah,
I know exactly how the hunted feel. Yes. Fantastic images here.
So,
You've got right in here to it looks like a mum and a cub here.
Yeah, again, this is another. This was photographed at a big cat sanctuary in the UK.
Okay.
Because this is an Amur leopard, it's the rarest big cat in the world. I think there are something like 50 of them left in the wild. They are right on the verge of extinction. I photographed this image for a project I was working on a few years ago called Animals on the Edge, which was all about conservation and critically endangered animals. And in order to photograph these cats in the wild would take years of just searching for them, because they are so few and they're in such a remote region. They live in Siberia. And so this was actually photographed at a big cat sanctuary in the UK. And what I particularly loved about it was it's that, you know, you've got the cubs are soft in the background, the sharpness is, the emphasis is on what the mother is doing, but you're not lost on the fact that the cub is there.
Exactly.
And it's that protective response that she has.
Yes.
To her cub, and it was a lovely moment just to see it. That you know, even though she's in an enclosure, it was a lovely moment of very natural behavior.
Let's just go to the next gallery, which is called Connections, and we'll just do a quick run through of these images, and these are real. These are, well, they're just fantastic. You know, the way you got the color there of this animal here.
It's a Bengal tiger. This was
photographed
in Kanha National Park in India, and in fact, this is an image that was pre-visualized. In that I had, before I even set out on the assignment, it was an image I'd got in my mind. I'd kind of thought about what it was I was trying to create.
Sure.
And it was very much this sort of connection between the elusiveness of a rare animal like a tiger, but also the power of the connection. And you know, there's the tiger burning bright, and Eye of the Tiger, and things like that going on in the back of my mind.
Comes through. Lovely shot here of the tiger in the snow there. Yeah,
this actually ended up being the cover of the Animals on the Edge book, the previous one. Again, it's all about, a lot of this is about eye contact. You'll notice with a lot of these pictures, this tiger is looking straight down the lens.
Yeah, he is.
And it's that connection that adds that little bit of extra power. See, quite often I think in wildlife photography, it's what I call the final 2% is what makes the difference between a good photograph and a great photograph. And that 2% is often little details. And in this particular case, there are two things. One is that contact, the eye looking straight at you.
Yeah.
The other one is, you notice the paw, the outstretched paw, is that it's not quite touching the snow. And there's that separation between the paw and the shadow.
Yes.
Which gives you that three-dimensional sense that, you know, it kind of adds just to the composition of it.
Yeah.
And those little details, I think, are quite key to improving photography and moving photography from one level to another.
Yes. It's showing some animals here. Oh, looks so cute, but I wouldn't like to be on the wrong side of that one. Isn't it amazing how they look so cute, these animals? And but then you know damn well that if they want something to eat, they will eat. So the detail in
they will, but interestingly, they don't. There is no animal on the planet that sees human beings as natural prey.
No.
And for me, has been most fascinating about this job, and in a way most rewarding about this job, is being able to spend some of my time, some of my life, literally, you know, within arm's length of some of these creatures. And yet knowing that I am in complete and utter safety, that they have no intention of harming me, and that I have no intention of harming them. And when you make that connection with an animal that is, you know, potentially incredibly dangerous, and when you get to sit, you know, as I say, kind of right next to a lion or a tiger or a grizzly bear, without any fear at all, then there is something incredibly special about that moment. Yeah. And, you know, it's one of those things that I think, as I say, for me, it's been a a big part of the reward of doing this job is that connection that we can make with analog.
It's just going through there. I'm going to come out of the screen share, Chris, and we're going to. Thanks very much indeed for talking through those points. And it's amazing to me that you're using effectively quite short lenses, 50mm. I'm thinking along the lines that if one was to go along with one of your workshops, you'd be sort of saying, right, you've got to bring along something like a 100 or 400 or anything bigger than that. Brilliant, because we're going to be sitting in a Land Rover and about, I don't know, 200 yards away from these particular animals. But it's a different approach, actually, because I've spoken to other wildlife photographers, and they have a tendency to look for the longer telephoto lenses and zoom lenses.
Yeah, I think for me, it's just, as I say, the connection is such an important part of my work. And I have this feeling that, it's very difficult to connect with an animal if you're standing half a mile away from it. And, while long lenses allow you to close that gap, they only do it in an optical way. They don't do it in an emotional way. And as I say, I think part of being able to understand what it is I'm trying to communicate with an image comes out of knowing what the story is. And it's just like people. If you were trying to make a connection with a person, you wouldn't do it from half a mile away.
No, exactly right.
You'd come together, you'd shake hands, you'd share a pint down the pub, and you'd talk.
Yeah.
And it's, in a way, it's no with wildlife. And all animals talk to us. It's just that they use a language which most of us don't understand, which is body language. But if you spend time learning about how animals communicate with each other, and you learn that language, and you can start to interpret what they're saying, then in fact there is this dialogue that goes on between you. And this is the thing, for example, that can keep you safe in this sort of environment.
Yeah, exactly.
When you are 10 yards away from a grizzly bear, I know I can be there is because the animal has allowed that to happen. And that's come about by watching its body language and understanding when I can stay and when I need to leave.
I think you make a very good point, actually, when you're talking about your images there, as regards you are not invading into their space.
No.
You're allowing them to come into your space. And there's a difference in what you're saying there. Chris, let's go back to the beginning then. When did photography really sort of grab you? But I always like to ask this question. What was your first recollection of a camera in your household as when you were a young kid?
Well, my first ever camera was a Nikon 35mm film camera.
Okay.
Which was 10 years old when I got it. I still have it.
Lovely, fantastic.
Somewhere, and so it must be at least 50 years old now.
Yeah.
It still works perfectly well. It still has every control on it that a photographer will ever need, which is fantastic.
Yes.
And occasionally I do still use it, but basically it was my father was a part-time semi-professional photographer, social and wedding photographer.
Oh, okay.
And so it was a Christmas present from my dad, and I remember it very well. And it was great in many ways in that it was a fully manual camera. There was nothing automatic on it at all. And because of that, I had to learn the true fundamentals of photography. I had to learn about exposure. I had to learn just by looking. It had no light meter. It did have a light meter in it, but it didn't work. And so I had to learn how to calculate an exposure just by looking at the brightness. And some of those key skills I still use now. So even with all the technology we have available to us, that ability to instantly look at light and think this is what the exposure should be without having to rely on the camera, particularly when you're working in a genre of photography that requires immediate response. If something happens in front of me, it happens in a split second. If I don't get it, I don't get it.
No, exactly.
And so that ability to be in control of the camera at all times is quite critical. And the knowledge that I gained from using that camera and following my dad around when I was a kid, and learning from him really was quite a critical thing.
So photography then was a very, very important part of your early life, by the sound of things.
It was an important part for about 3 or 4 years, up until I became a teenager. And And then when I became a teenager, two things happened. One of them was that I woke up on my 13th birthday and suddenly realized that my dad was more of an embarrassment than he was a mentor. And of course, I didn't want to be seen with him anymore. Which came home to me, funnily enough, today. I took my son into town today. He's 12, going on 13. And after we got out of the car, he said, "Well, are you going as well?" And I said, "Yeah, I've got some stuff to do in town." He said, "Well, you have to walk in a different direction."
There you go.
So, what do you mean I have to walk in a different direction? He said, "Well, Dad, it's just embarrassing to be around you."
Happens to every dad.
So, you know, what goes around comes around.
Very much so. Very much so.
So yeah, and you know, like anything else, I was 13. I discovered girls and fun, and you know, in those days, photography wasn't quite as sexy as it is today. You know, it wasn't about computers and stuff like that. It was more about you know, dark bathrooms and locking your sister out of the bathroom for a couple of hours every night. So, to be honest, at one point, the camera really pretty much got put in a cupboard and left there, and it wasn't until actually probably when I was about 25.
Okay.
That for a reason that I can't even describe, I woke up one day and thought, I think I'll buy a new camera. And I said this thing with wildlife, this fascination with nature and how nature works and how everything is connected, had become a very big part of my life. So in fact, it was more that my fascination with nature drove the photography. It wasn't the other way around.
I was going to ask
and
you
even
that.
to this day,
I was going to ask you that.
Yeah,
so,
even today, my
fascination of wildlife before photography. If it wasn't photography led you into wildlife, you had an interest and a fascination of wildlife before you started taking photographs.
Yes, and that what basically happened was, I think I said earlier, I started. When I started to learn all of this information that I wanted to communicate, I then had a decision to make to how do I communicate that with the outside world, and my choice was photography. So yes, it was very much, and still very much is, it's the story that fascinates me. I love telling stories.
I think
stories mostly through photography.
And definitely we can see that from the style of the image that you created. Let me just take you back a little bit further in school life. You finished school. What did you study? Did you go on to university or any of that nature, or did you go straight into work?
Yeah, well, I didn't go to university. I went on to higher education. I did a 2-year business studies course because at one point I wanted to be an accountant, believe it or not.
Okay.
And although one year of accountancy study pretty much put me off that career.
I can imagine.
But yeah, and then I went into a career. I started off as a business, and my job was assessing the credit worthiness of, you know, when they were trying to get business loans and credit facilities, and it's kind of strange in a way that it's completely unconnected with. But I have to say that when I made the jump to being a professional photographer, a lot of that business knowledge that I had accumulated over the sort of the 14, 15 years before, because from a business analyst I moved into marketing, and from marketing I moved into sales, and that knowledge was incredibly important in helping me understand that if I wanted to be a professional wildlife photographer, if I actually really wanted to earn a living out of it, then, you know, while the photography part is the fun bit, you cannot ignore that you have to also run this as a business.
Exactly.
And, you know, there are very many parts that make a business successful. Often they're the bits that people don't really want to do, but, you know, as a one-man band, you have to do them.
Yeah.
But, you know, I had about 8 years in sales, so I wasn't frightened of selling.
No.
And so, you know, going in my very early days, you know, going knocking on doors, literally, with a portfolio under my arm, and writing and talking to, you know, to editors of magazines wasn't scary to me. And so, you know, although they say there doesn't seem to be a big connection between business and photography, there's a very big, a huge connection between having business acumen and being able to run a successful business, whatever that business is. In my case, it was wildlife photography. So
I was going to ask you in actual fact how you actually developed your contacts, and you've just answered it there by basically getting a good portfolio put together and then effectively just knocking on doors.
Just knocking on doors, and you know, I don't know whether I was fortunate in that, you know, I got rejections, of course, like everybody does, but I also got some very good early successes. And I think I very quickly got a book contract, and it was with the Guild of Master Craftsmen Publications, who are the company that publish outdoor. But this actually was even we were publishing the magazine. And I became very good friends with the commissioning editor at the time, a guy called Paul Richardson. Sadly he's no longer with us now, but we picked up a very good rapport very early on, and he gave me my first book contract after only about 2 years. And
that's amazing.
You know, yeah, and of course this was pre-online publishing and
exactly,
and stuff like that. So, and in those days, having a book was a huge calling card.
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
It very quickly put me on the map, and so that was a big help. And you know, Paul continued to be a very big supporter of my work while he was alive. And but yeah, I mean, you know, I quite often get asked this question about, you know, I want to be a wildlife photographer. How do I do it? And you know, in terms of doing it as truly as a professional, because you know, you can be a wildlife photographer and not need to earn a living from it if you earn a living from doing something else. But if you want to run it truly as a business, then it's about understanding that it is a business, and you have to do all of those things that any business requires. And the most important of which, of course, is selling your work.
Yeah, exactly.
You know, it's all very well taking fantastic pictures, but nobody ever sees them. And of course, as I say, the internet when I started out, so there wasn't this ability to show stuff off through the internet. So it very much meant, you know, I picked a portfolio of work that I felt was very strong. And I think, you know, that's a critical thing for anybody even now, that, you know, when you start thinking about putting images together for whether it's a portfolio for display, for trying to sell it, or for competitions, is, you know, always make sure it's your absolute best work.
Yeah, the very best.
And
tell us about
if you ever look at a picture and say,
sorry to interrupt you, Chris. Tell us about the portfolio itself, in brief terms, as regards to how it was created, and what sort of wildlife did you take to create that portfolio to effectively get that first book published? Where were they taken, for instance? Was it local zoos or local parks, or had you had an opportunity to go out to Africa or other places?
Yeah, I had actually traveled a lot, because my interest has always been in big mammals, and in particular with predators. And so my fascination had always been around those areas. So for about five or 6 years while I was still working, photography was becoming a more and more important part of my life. Wildlife photography was becoming a more important part of my life. So a lot of the time, you know, when I had time off from work, I would use that time to go and travel, Africa a lot, Asia a little bit, and North America. And I kind of devoted my holiday time, if you like, to photography. And so that gave me an opportunity to build a collection of images, you know, without any stress behind having to create them. And the initial portfolio was largely work from those first few years when I was, you know, learning the trade, so to speak, and a little bit from the first year. I had 2 or 3 opportunities for 2 or 3 assignments in the first year, I think, all of which were to Africa. So that helped as well.
And how many images were in the portfolio when you actually were knocking on doors? Because I think this is a very important point, actually, with regards to the size of a portfolio.
Yes, I think that. I mean, if I remember, it was a long time ago, but probably around 20 images.
Yeah.
And I think that, you know, I think there are a couple of things that are important here. One is that if there's a difference between 15 fantastic images and 15 fantastic images and 5 mediocre ones, then go with 15 images. You've only got 12 fantastic images, go with 12. Don't pad it out with stuff that's just doesn't quite make the grade, because that's what they recognize. Interestingly, I was talking with Steve Watkins, who's the editor of Outdoor Photography magazine, a couple of months ago, and he was actually giving a presentation on how to get published. And one of the things that he said was, if you send in prints, or in the old days, if you sent in transparencies, he said he would only ever look at 4 of them, because he would pull them out of the envelope like this, and it was only the first 4 that he could see. He said if those 4 weren't good enough, the rest never came out.
Exactly, yeah.
And so I think an important point for those interested in showing their work with the thought of selling it, put in the really, really powerful, compelling images. And if you've only got 6, then only send 6.
Only send 6, exactly. It's a very good point, actually, because I think sometimes, and I've tried to do it myself, you look at so many images and you think, oh yes, I'll keep that one, I'll keep that, and before you realize you've got 50, and then you've got to start paring them down, and really sort of then the hard work really starts. And of course, what you don't want to do, I've only done it once or twice when I was a lot younger, when you're presenting work, you don't want to get that viewer becoming bored of what he's looking at. You wanted to maintain his interest in your work. Let's switch. Well, it's not switching actually, because you've already mentioned the fact that your first camera was a Nikon mat, and or the Nikon, and then a Nikon mat camera. You stayed with Nikon basically for quite a while. That I do know, Chris. And well established in the Nikon system, and still using it. What do you use? Let's bring you right up to date. What are you using at the moment in the Nikon system now? What is your camera bag for the Nikon gear?
In the Nikon system, I'm basically using D810s, and a range of lenses that pretty much go from fisheye up to a 300mm.
Okay.
I use the D810 for a very specific reason, and that is that some of my work now is sold as fine art prints, and big prints. These are things that are being blown up to 5, 6, 7, 8 feet.
Sure.
And in order to get a quality print that's 6 foot long, you need a lot of resolution. And so the big benefit of the 810 is that it gives me that 36 megapixel full frame chip, and from that I can create high quality big prints. So I use it for a very specific part of my work, and I still like the Nikon system. I've grown up with it, I've got used to it. The one thing that I found with it, though, and I don't know whether it's just a fact that I'm getting older, but it's heavy.
It's starting to be heavy,
Yeah, and when you're having to lug this stuff around, jungles for 4 weeks at a time, or you clambering up mountains and things like that with this stuff on your back, it actually starts to really weigh down.
Yes, sure.
A couple of years ago, I started looking at technology and seeing where it was going, and I started actually writing about my views as to where I thought digital technology was going to lead us. And one of the points I made at the time was that, for me, the next big thing to disappear in the DSLR camera would be the mirror.
Yeah.
For many reasons, because it's such a limiting factor in camera design. It reduces image quality. It makes the camera heavier. It makes the camera bigger. It introduces handling issues like vibration that we can all live without, particularly if you are using big, long telephoto lenses, which is magnifying everything.
Yes.
And then Fujifilm brought out the X-T1.
Yeah.
And this was for me was an interesting development, because for the first time ever, I felt that here was a mirrorless camera that had the same functionality and capability that DSLR cameras offer. And So I spoke to Fuji. I went to meet with them in Bedford, and I said, look, I'm kind of interested in using the system. However, I don't want you to give me a camera, because if you give me a camera, then everybody's going to say, well, the only reason I'm using it is because you're giving me stuff. I said, if you want to lend me one while I test it, that's great. But if I want to carry on, I want to buy one.
Mm-hmm.
And so they did. They lent me an XT1 and a couple of lenses, and I tested it for about 3 or 4 months, and actually found that in terms of functionality, it was delivering everything that I needed in a wildlife camera, and in terms of weight and size, it was just beautiful.
It was half the weight. Exactly. Yeah.
It's half the size and it's half the weight. It's just like, this is incredible, and the quality of the image was spectacular, and so I kind of now use both systems a little bit in tandem. I use the Fuji for a lot of my day-to-day work, and then I use the Nikon, as I say, for some very specific type images when I'm creating stuff for the gallery, and so the two systems work in tandem. But it's quite interesting, because if you put the two cameras down next to each other, and something in front of you happens, and you ask yourself the question, okay, well, which camera do I want to pick up?
Yes.
And the answer to that question is always Fuji. The Fuji is the camera I want to pick up.
Yes.
And I think that says system, because for me, I'm not overly interested in cameras. I'm not overly interested in equipment and gear. As I said before, my interest in photography is wildlife. Photography is just a medium, it's a means to an end. Yeah. And so I think it's important that when you're using a camera, you choose a camera that helps you to achieve what it is that you're trying to do. I'm picking up a tool to do a job.
Yes, exactly.
And I don't care what's stamped on the front in reality. I don't care whether it's Nikon or Canon or Fuji or Hasselblad or whatever. I just care whether it does the job. And one of the things I love about the Fuji is that it helps me to do my job. And so it's becoming a very important part of the kit bag now.
I think another thing, if I might sort of attempt to comment here, the basis that probably why you like the Fuji XT1 so much is it reminds you so much of the retro look of the Nikon mat that you had before.
It actually is very true, and I was going to say that before and I didn't, but that is absolutely right. I do love. Yeah. For me, it looks like a camera, and I know that's a very old-fashioned thing to say, but I was brought up on the old. I remember having a Zenith, and I remember
the Zenith E. Yes, I had one of those.
And all of those cameras, and there is a little bit of a throwback to the past, and the sort of the retro look of the Fuji does tug at the heartstrings. So. But
I think what Fuji have done basically in terms of the way they've created, they've always created good quality lenses. The lenses are of out of the top drawer with the newer the Canon and the Nikon ranges that they were developing tended to sort of take away the aperture ring. That was the first thing I saw disappearing, even in the top end range cameras, and that was all basically push button, wheel control button at the back of the cameras. Really, I suppose to sort of say you're holding onto your camera and you've got the wheel to finger sort of touch availability for you. But there was this thing that I don't know whether I'm right in saying this. I do think sometimes photographers, especially that have come through from film, do like the mechanical aspects of a camera. They like to turn a knob.
I think the key to it is that we like to be in control of the camera.
In control of the camera,
And I think that there's a very interesting analogy here with where car manufacturing is going. We buy cars now, and everything is done for you. I mean, I was watching an advert the other day for the latest. I think it's a Volvo.
Yes.
That has some kind of automatic steering in it, so you can be sitting in the car. You don't even have to steer it anymore.
Yes.
Well, that's all very well when it works.
It's very true.
But the moment it goes wrong, know how to control the car, then you're going to crash. And it's not quite so dramatic with photography, but it's great when all this technology works for you. But in the moment it goes wrong, if you don't know what to do, then you end up missing the shot.
Yes.
Now, if it's a hobby, okay, well, you missed an opportunity. If it's a business, you've missed the opportunity to earn money. Mm-hmm. And So for me, it's all about being in control of the camera and me being in control of it and not the other way around.
Yes.
And yes, one of the things that the Fuji gives me is much more of a sense of control.
Yes.
Whereas with a lot of the DSLRs now, so much of it is being automated that, you know, people who come into photography now, I think, are a little bit at a disadvantage because they don't have that background knowledge. They're not forced to learn the background fundamentals of photography. The camera kind of does it for you. But I think, you know, in a way, you're kind of missing a really big part of it.
Yeah, another point which I'd like to make, in fact, that yes, okay, with regards to the professional photographer, he knows about composition, but the cameras of today, in actual fact, create such almost a perfect image. It's almost impossible not to get a photograph which is out of focus and delivers. Whereas when you compare with basically I don't know what it is, but when I switched to the Fuji, all of a sudden my photography seemed to change in a situation what it was like before digital. Whether that's down to the sensor or whether it's down to the way the camera behaves, but it's certainly somewhere along the line where I think I do partly blame Nikon and Canon for this, or almost trying to produce the two perfect camera, the noiseless image a shot. Where if you look at some good quality images from now and way back in the good old days, they had grain and they had noise in the images, and it added that atmosphere to the image.
Yes, I think this is true, and I think we see this a lot in all forms of media now.
Yes.
You know, whether it be an image, a photographic image, or, you know, the high definition television image, that to an extent it has just become unreal because we don't see the world in high definition.
No, exactly right.
And so you start to see things. I mean, I was watching a program on a ultra high definition television the other day, and I was thinking, well, just watching this, I can see exactly where the light guy is standing.
Yes.
I can tell exactly what lights they're using. It is so strong that information is now becoming visible. Whereas, you know, in the old days, it was invisible. And, you know, certainly in terms of film and in the early days of digital, where, you know, the resolution wasn't as high as it is now, then, you know, there's a much more real atmosphere to the picture.
Yeah,
I think than
I quite agree with you.
Now. And of course, in the end of the day, photography is not about, for me, it's not about technical perfection. For me, the whole point of a photograph is, does it elicit an emotional response?
Yeah.
Does it make me feel something? Because if it doesn't, I don't care how technically perfect it is. If it doesn't make me feel anything, why am I looking at the picture?
Yes.
You know, and so for me, that is the gauge of a successful image: is does it elicit this emotional response?
Yeah, very true.
And that is, for me, has always been the end gauge. And photography is an art, and, you know, you look at paintings by Monet, for example, and you know, the whole impressionist era began because Monet's eyesight disappeared. You know, he could see properly, and he couldn't afford glasses, and so he started to paint what he saw, and what he saw was blurry haystacks. So
exactly.
You know, and that's photography. It's just art through photographs.
It's a very good point you make, actually, because just very briefly picking up on that, because I want to talk about your workshops. But one thing, I was doing a little workshop yesterday, and we were talking about street photography, and we looked at some street photography, and then I showed them Daido Moriyama, which in actual fact I don't think he's ever taken a crystal crisp, sharp, focused image in his life. And the guys were saying, what are you showing me here? And I said, look at it, feel it, atmosphere. And the penny, I think, dropped. The penny dropped, which was a bit of a kudos for me, to be honest with you. Let's talk about your workshops, Chris. We're getting close to the length of time. You do a number of workshops through the year. Tell us about where the places that you visit and sort of how many people come along to these workshops.
Yeah, we do a number to different locations. Typically we run some which are sort of short workshops, which are usually to Europe or closer to home, sometimes in the UK. And then we run a number of photo safaris, which can be to anywhere really, from the key wildlife hotspots like Africa, Asia, and North America. And for us, the main part of the workshop is obviously giving people the opportunity to photograph iconic wildlife.
Yeah.
A very big part of it for us is something that we call training the photographer, because for me, photography is a very personal thing. And when I take a photograph, I'm expressing myself through that photograph. I'm telling you how I feel about a particular subject or a particular place. And I think that's what we're all trying to achieve when we set out to do anything that is creative. We're trying to express ourselves. But in order to do that, you kind of have to understand who you are.
Yeah.
And a lot of this, again, we right at the beginning, we talked about, going out without the camera and making connection with the subject that you're photographing or with the land that's around you, and using that connection to inform the way that you then pitch. And how you do that, that isn't done through learning aperture and shutter speed.
No.
That's done through learning about yourself and how you connect to wildlife. And a lot of it is about, things like just being mindful of where you are, being present in that moment that you're taking the picture.
Mm-hmm.
And so, this is one of the things that we try to do on the workshops and the safaris that we run, is helping people to become more creative.
Yes.
Not creative in the sense of, if I take this animal from this picture and this one from this one, I can stick it in Photoshop. It's about learning to see the world better, so that you can photograph it better. And for me, this is where unique images come from. I can photograph what is on the surface, then we just create records. And in creating a record, you're just showing people what they would see if they were there.
Mm-hmm.
I think that compelling image, that image that makes people go, wow, it comes from inside you. But in order for that image to come out, you have to learn how to get in touch with it.
Which brings us back basically to the photograph where you showed right at the beginning of the wildebeest, where you had been taking the photographs of the wildebeest. You've got basically your stock by the sound of things. And then you thought, well, hold on a minute. And you went out on your own without the camera and you watched and observed the behavior. And it's one of those penny drop moments where you think, blur, movement, action. That's what my images have been missing. And you come up with that stunning image.
Yes, and that's it. It's about allowing people to get that light bulb moment.
Yes.
And a lot of the time we photograph from the head, and I think this comes back to this whole thing about the technical side of photography.
Yes.
That's all driven from knowledge and from the head, but the real photographs, the ones that we were talking about that created an emotional response, those photographs that in some way touch us, well, they come from the heart.
Yes.
And it's about, the workshops often are really about helping people to get in touch with themselves, so that they can communicate what they feel through the photograph. And of course, that's what makes that photograph unique.
Yeah, exactly.
And
right.
I think in reality, that's kind of what we're all striving for, is creating an image that is unique to us.
Yeah, very true. Come to that time of the show, Chris, where I'm going to ask you the two most difficult questions. My guests seem to find. Who would you rate as your favorite photographer?
Actually, for me, it's a very easy question to answer, because there's one photographer who for a long time has sat kind of up above everybody else for me. Nick Nichols. He's a National Geographic photographer. In the later years, I think he was their only staff photographer. And I read somewhere recently he's about to retire, which is such a shame. But for me, there are two things about Nick's work that for me stand out. One is that whenever I came up with an idea for a photograph, almost immediately I'd found that he'd already done it. So his photographers, it was always a step ahead, was always doing things that the rest of us kind of wanted to do. He'd done it. And I admired him hugely for that. And The other thing comes back to what I was saying before, is that, you know, I've got a book of his, and, you know, I flick through the book often, and I look at these images, and very few of them are technically perfect.
Yes.
But every single one of them answers that question about, does it make me feel something?
Yeah, the images resonate with you.
Yeah, they do very much. So yeah, Michael Nichols.
Michael McNichols. I was going to. Thanks for repeating that, because you just cut out when you actually said his surname the first time around. Michael McNichols. It's interesting you say that, actually, because my favorite photographer is Saul Leiter, the New York street photographer. And it's his color book, and I've got his mono book as well. But his color book, I just pick up, and I can go through those images every single day of the year, and they just. And
they move.
Exactly right. They move me, and it's interesting comment you make there. Who would be your the person that's been your inspiration?
Wow, that's an interesting question, and I think that in many ways it's not a photographer. I'm inspired. Actually, I'm hugely inspired by my grandfather.
Okay.
Just because of the sort of person that he was, and so he was a very big influence on my early life. But also in terms of you know, my work moving forward, I'm inspired by outstanding people, and it doesn't really matter what area of work that they're in or what area of creativity they're in. I'm I'm inspired by people who push boundaries and do things that the rest of us sometimes believe are impossible. And, you know, it's people like, you know, there's an astronaut called Hadfield, and he wrote a book recently called An Astronaut's Guide to Life on Earth, and it describes, you know, how he became an astronaut. And it's a fascinating life story. He was Canadian, and in those days you couldn't be an astronaut unless you were American.
Yeah.
And yet, you know, at the age of 10, he said, I want to be an astronaut. And he lived his life from the age of 10 as if he was going to be an astronaut, even though everybody told him that his chances of doing it were less than 1.1.
Yeah, exactly.
But every decision from the age of 10, every decision that I made with the view of becoming an astronaut. And so it's people like that that inspire me, and it inspires me to do things with the camera that sometimes we don't think are possible.
Yeah.
And that is where creativity is born. You know, that is what takes photography from where it is now to where it will be tomorrow.
Yeah.
And in doing that, I found it's also what takes me from the person I am today to the person I could be tomorrow.
Yeah.
And so that's where I find inspiration in people that you know have been on that journey, and helped me along that journey.
Yeah. And I think also another thing that must be said here about in particular your field, it is such an important job which you are doing in bringing wildlife and nature to our attention. As you said, you mentioned there that lion or tiger there that was basically what the 50 left in the world. Bringing the attention to that, we have to look after this wildlife. It's such an important aspect of our world, and the elephant as well, and the lions and all those. And it's such an important job to keep us aware of these fantastic, beautiful animals that live this world with us as well.
And I think this is another important point for anybody that are interested in getting more involved in photography, which is, you know, it's stand for something that's bigger than yourself.
Yes.
You know, photography in some ways can be very self-serving, and without doubt there have been times for me where it has been very self-serving. But, you know, I look at my photographs and the ones that give me the most pleasure, and the assignments I work on that I get the most reward from are those where I'm making images for another purpose.
Yes.
And And certainly, the whole area of conservation is very big for me, and it has been in my work. And I think that's a key point. So, stand for something that's bigger than yourself, and that way your photographs can become a part of something that helps to move us forward, and to move the world forward.
And even if for argument's sake you are a hobbyist and you're fortunate enough to go on safari and you take your photographs, you're doing just as an important job. Absolutely. By recording it for yourself. If you get the opportunity like you have to put it into print, then that's the sort of the icing on the cake, isn't it, or the cherry on the cake? But
it's a cherry on the cake. But I think this is a critical point as well, that every one of us with a camera can make a difference.
Yeah, very true.
If you take one picture a year, or whether you take 10,000 pictures a year, it doesn't matter whether it's a hobby or whether it's a profession. Every single one of us can make a difference, more so now than ever before, because we have the power of the internet.
Yeah.
When I first started, it was much harder to get your images out to a wide audience. Now it's actually relatively easy. So we have the power to do it, and it's about encouraging people, as I said, to take images that are meaningful to them, and not just records of things that happen. And if we do that, then I'd say whether it's one image a year, whether it's 10,000 images a year, everybody can make a difference.
Yeah.
It would be fantastic if if photography was a big part of moving, as I say, moving us forward.
Yeah, exactly right. And that's a very good sentiment to finish on, I think, Chris. Thank you so much for joining me today. It's been fascinating to listen to
my pleasure.
with your images as well, and discussing all that aspect, and talking about Nikon and Fuji. Absolutely superb. Thanks. We've had a few viewers as well on this. I think we've had around about 10 viewers, which is absolutely fantastic for that. I'm really appreciative for those that joined us live. Again, thanks to Chris. And just to say, well, what's today? Thursday. So unfortunately, this short week, and we've still got one more day to go. But if you're out there shooting this weekend, everybody, leave your camera bag at home. How about that? All the best to you. Bye for now.